Good evening and welcome to UCSD Conversations. I'm Mary Walshock, Associate Vice Chancellor for Public Programs at the University of California, San Diego. It is my pleasure to introduce you to some of our faculty and their cutting-edge research. Please join us for an enlightening evening of conversation. Tonight we present a special edition of UCSD Conversations focusing on climate. We'll look at research on the effects of climate change on California's water supply. We'll hear about a unique research collaboration to forecast ocean and atmospheric interactions. And we'll look at a new device which provides instant analysis of atmospheric particles. But first, it's the politics and policy of climate research with Lisa Shaffer, the Director of Policy Programs and International Relations at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She is with our guest host tonight, Ron B. Ron?
Thanks very much, Mary. I'm Ron B., and I'm filling in for the esteemed Pat Ledden, and welcome to UCSD Conversations. I work at the statewide UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, based here at UCSD. And I'm the Director of Development and Special Projects there. My special project today, however, is to have a conversation with you and with a friend and colleague from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Lisa Shaffer. Lisa is the Director of International Relations and Policy Programs at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She wears a lot of hats, and one of her important hats deals with climate policy, and that is she's the Executive Director of the UC Revelle program on climate science and policy. That's a lot of introduction, Lisa, but basically thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, our topic is climate policy today. We know in California that that's important for agriculture, that climate is important for tourism, that it's important for our stereotype as Californians that we live in sunny California, but climate policy is a lot more than just the state of California. It's global, and why should we care about climate policy? And why is it important?
Well, we live on a planet that has a climate. It's an interconnected system of ocean, atmosphere, land, and there are natural variabilities in the climate. Cycles that take place on periods of a year to 2 years. There are variabilities that take place on the scale of tens of years and on centuries and millennia even. And it's important to understand what the natural variability of the planet is, and then to understand the impact that human activity has had on it. In the last 100 years since the Industrial Revolution, human activity has altered the planet and affected the balance that was being managed through natural systems. And we're starting to see the impacts of those human activities on our natural systems in the form of increased temperature, increased severity of rain and storm events, the rise of sea level, just to give a few examples. And so the objective of climate policy is to first understand and then to develop ways to respond to, manage, or adapt to the changes that are taking place on the Earth as a result of human intervention in the climate system. As one of my colleagues at Scripps said, we've moved from the audience up to the stage, and we're performing as part of the climate system now, where we used to just be bystanders.
You were on the stage in 1992 as well, when the first climate conference took place in Rio. Could you tell us a little bit about what took place in 1992 and how that evolved to something that is referred to as the Kyoto Protocol?
Sure. Back in the 1980s and before, scientists started to recognize that there was an increase in the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and these contribute to something called the greenhouse effect. And I think we all know that the Earth is surrounded by an atmosphere, and that incoming sunlight passes through the atmosphere and then bounces back out as infrared heat. And some of the gases and water vapor in the atmosphere trap that heat and create a kind of greenhouse effect. And that's what makes this planet habitable. It's a good thing. We need it to survive as a planet. Otherwise, we'd be like the moon with no atmosphere. But the increases in CO2 are contributing to additional heat being trapped by the atmosphere. And when this came to the attention of politicians at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, a treaty was signed called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC.
That's a mouthful, isn't it?
Right.
What it really means is that they were concerned about increases in temperature, what they used to call global warming. And the term seems to have shifted, if I'm not mistaken, from global warming to climate change, and that term is encapsulated in this agreement, is it not?
Yeah, the 1992 treaty was signed by about 175 countries, including the United States. George Bush, the elder, signed it on behalf of the U.S., and it was ratified. And it calls on countries to limit their greenhouse gas emissions to a safe level, without defining what a safe level is. And then supplementary agreements, discussions and negotiations have taken place that led to the Kyoto Protocol, which I'll describe in a minute. But you asked about the term global warming and climate change. The warming of the atmosphere is only one manifestation of the changes that human activity are causing on the planet. It's not just temperature, it's precipitation, it's the amount of rain that falls, it's the patterns of rainfall, it's the distribution of those changes across the globe, because nobody lives in average global temperature land. Everybody lives in a particular place, and the impacts are different depending on whether you live by the coast, whether you live in the mountains, if you're in the tropics, if you're in the higher latitudes. So global warming is really a trivialization, in effect, of a very complex process that's taking place.
Let's get back to Kyoto, as it's referred to. What is it trying to do, essentially? Is it trying to set up some standards so that we can keep track of the carbon dioxide that we emit from our cars and from our factories and from heating things? What is it trying to do?
The Kyoto Protocol is a supplementary agreement under this UN convention that was signed in '92. And what it aims to do is to set binding targets and timetables. The Rio Agreement was a voluntary agreement, and every country said, we'll try, we'll do our best. But there was no enforcement, there was no standard, there was no target to which they were held. And in Kyoto, countries agreed on specific targets to reduce on average by about 7% below the levels of 1990 the emissions of 6 different greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but 5 others as well, and to do that by approximately 2010 as the first phase of an enforceable, specific, binding agreement.
And the United States signed that protocol, and it was
right.
George the First, I think it was.
No, George the First signed the UN Framework Convention in '92. Al Gore actually signed the Kyoto Protocol during the Clinton administration. That was in 1997. But what has never happened is that it has not been submitted to the Senate for ratification. And under our governmental system, a treaty does not take effect unless it's ratified by the Senate. And that's what the debate really is about in the U.S., is whether we will ratify the protocol.
Yeah, I'd like to move to that now. What's at stake in this for the United States? Of course, we emit a lot of the greenhouse gases, if I'm not mistaken. But in your view and in the view of your colleagues at Scripps and in the UC program, what's at stake here?
We try very hard not to take policy positions in our program. We're interested in getting the science of the climate, both economic and social science, as well as the natural science of the chemistry and physics of the atmosphere, to understand how the climate works. And we can do what-if scenarios and models and say, if greenhouse gases continue to rise at the rate that they're going now, if we get to double the pre-industrialized levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, there are estimates of something like $300 billion a year in damages on a global scale, about 1.5% of global GDP. And the reason for that is things like flooding, sea level encroachment on coastal areas, impacts on agriculture from severe storms and droughts, increased severity of hurricanes. When you put more energy into the atmosphere, which is what heating does, heat is energy, then that energy has to go somewhere. It's trapped in the earth by the greenhouse effect, and so it manifests itself in severe weather events, and those have economic consequences.
Well, that makes perfect sense. I want to get back to the science policy conundrum, if you will, because certainly the program that you lead is on climate science and policy, and so you have to take them both and put them together and build bridges between the two. It strikes me that it must be quite interesting to see scientists for the first time interact with the political process, and that this political process is quite intense. at these conference of the parties meetings that have taken place. Could you explain, or your observations of how Scripps and UC scientists have interacted with the policy process? Has it been a two-way street? Have people been learning on both sides of the fence here?
Sure. The UC Revelle program on climate science and policy was set up to build those bridges between the science and the policymakers. And we don't mean just government, we mean people in industry. People make decisions every day based on their understanding of the climate, and they have impacts on the climate by the behaviors that they take. So we've done a number of things. We have registered status as a non-governmental organization, an NGO, and we have the ability to send formal delegations to these annual meetings of the parties to the UN Framework Convention. Like you said, COP some number. Kyoto was COP 3. We sent a team to Buenos Aires in 1998 for COP 4, and also to The Hague 2 years ago for COP 6. And what we tried to do is to present our science and economics in an objective way to anybody who wanted to listen, who was there, the delegations, the journalists, the environmental activists, the industrial lobbyists. Anybody who was there could come and listen and ask questions of a scientist, and we could be honest brokers. And one example of what happened was a delegation from Panama, and they had a lot of questions. They didn't really understand how soils and trees work as far as absorbing carbon.
There's not many scientists that are at these delegations.
They're very few, or none in most cases. It's usually diplomats. And they came and talked to our delegation, asked a lot of questions, and when they got back to Panama, they asked if we would send a scientist down to Panama to meet with their whole government climate group to help them understand more about the science and develop better policies. We've also recognized that during the actual negotiating session, people are pretty busy and their negotiating positions have already been formed before they got there. So the best we can do is get their attention that maybe after the meeting's over, they ought to start thinking about some new ideas or follow up with us. So we've been trying to find funding to organize conferences, and we organized one workshop last fall to bring industry people, negotiators, and academics together to talk between negotiating sessions, to try to have a very safe learning environment where nobody has to take political positions or make speeches, but they can honestly exchange information. And our scientists have found it fascinating. They've never seen a political negotiation before. They don't really understand how industry makes decisions. And so they've found it very beneficial, as have our students, because we've made an effort to involve graduate students in this activity as well.
I remember that last meeting very well because it took place on September 10th and 11th.
Yes.
It's going to be one of those questions that always comes up. Where were you on September 11th? Like the Kennedy assassination, like the older generation in Pearl Harbor. And it was clear to us at that meeting, with everyone present, that something had changed in terms of national priorities, that no one was quite sure how this would affect climate policy. And so I'd like to ask you, too, how has the Bush II administration coming to power, as well as the events of September 11th, affected the outlook for developing the kinds of programs you'd like to see happen?
Well, I guess there's a lot of answers to that question. As we all know, George Bush, the current president, decided to withdraw from the Kyoto process, saying that the economic impact on the U.S. was too great to justify the actions that were being requested through the Kyoto Protocol. And that raised a lot of public reaction, and it's clear that this issue is important and that the Bush administration has recognized now that it is important. And the issue is partly what to do about Kyoto, but it's more generally what to do about increasing greenhouse gases and our fuel use and our environmental policies in this country. And there are lots of ways to affect the climate change problem without signing up to the Kyoto Protocol. That's one mechanism, and it has its detractors and it has its proponents. But if we had an energy policy in the United States that led us to reduce our overall emissions, it wouldn't really matter whether we officially signed the Kyoto Protocol or not. So the debate that's going on now is how to balance economic interests and environmental interests. And one of the problems is, not unique to the Bush administration, the payoff for taking action now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions won't be visible for 50 or 100 years. So people are being asked to sacrifice now to disrupt existing industries for a payoff that's going to come a few generations from now. What we're trying to do is find ways to articulate the short-term benefits. The air will be cleaner, people will be healthier, we'll save money by paying less for fuel, and we'll increase our national security by reducing our energy our dependence on foreign energy. All of those things are good things to do for other reasons, and they are positive things in terms of climate change.
Is that argument being heard, though, in terms of linking national security to climate over the long term?
I think that remains to be seen. There are certainly some people talking about it, and some hope that we can link improve fuel efficiency, energy efficiency, with reductions of dependence on foreign oil. There are, of course, others who are saying, let's just drill in Alaska and get more domestic energy to meet our needs.
Certain folks who come from Texas, by any chance?
I'm not going there,
okay.
Ron.
All right.
We're trying to be policy neutral and live in the academic world here. But the point is that one of the other impacts of September 11th, of course, has been a shift in budget priorities in the administration and money going to Homeland Security as opposed to basic research. Fortunately, or unfortunately, the same kinds of environmental measurements that one would want to make to understand the Earth system, how the air and the atmosphere, the air, the water, the land, the ice are interacting, is also relevant for Homeland Security and bioterrorism defense. And so monitoring the atmosphere against chemical agents that some bad guys might introduce, and monitoring the atmosphere to measure trace gases and changes in emissions of greenhouse gases are all the same technology and the same science. And so we're trying to show they're win-win solutions that will benefit both the environment and the current national security priorities of the administration.
Well, these are all very noble goals, and they speak to national priorities. I want to go from national now to international. We have a nice map here of the globe, and this is a global problem. What sort of problems have we run into with our friends in Europe and developing countries over climate change issues?
Well, it's clear the rest of the world was very disappointed that the U.S. decided to withdraw from the Kyoto process, because we are the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. We have the biggest economy. We have the means for developing cleaner technologies and for helping solve these problems on an international basis. So there was certainly a political cost to the U.S. internationally by our behavior. I have to be optimistic, because it's in my nature, that we will find ways to eventually do the right thing and sort of repair the damage that we did to our international relations by taking action. There may be some face-saving way to do a post-Kyoto or Kyoto round 2 process that we can participate in without having to backtrack, but where we'll recognize the value of international leadership and play a heavier role in this problem. But at the moment, there was certainly a political cost internationally from
Sure. Where do you see, well, as you know, the University of California has 3 missions: teaching, research, and public policy. Where do you see the scientists and social scientists of the University of California, because you draw on all campuses for your program, where do you see them playing a role in this process of optimism that you've outlined for us?
There are a couple things. We're training students at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, for instance, who really want to understand the policy world, and we're trying to find opportunities for them, given a funding availability, if we can find it, for internships to go work, for instance, in industry or in a policy organization for a summer and get some hands-on experience with how their science is used. To teach people it's not enough just to be an academic and do research, but you need to go beyond the ivory tower and be able to communicate your research to people who make decisions that might be better informed by that research that you've done. So we're teaching students, training the next generation of leaders who will have to solve this problem if we don't do it. We're doing the research to improve our understanding of the process. And climate science is not something that you do once and then you've figured it all out and you move on to do policy. It's going to be a continuous relationship between the scientists and the policymakers. Just like in medicine, just because we haven't cured cancer doesn't mean we're waiting to do anything in the medical field to address people who have the problem. We need to be continuing the research and doing the treatment at the same time.
What you're saying is that the health of the planet is a long-term goal.
That's right. And we're still working on both the diagnosis and the treatment in parallel. We understand better how it works, how the system works, and then we can find better interventions to solve the problems.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon here, but I wanted to give you an opportunity, if I could, to sort of speculate a little bit for our viewers. Now, what if we don't take this problem of climate change, global warming, and climate policy seriously? Does it mean that we're going to have some sort of catastrophe before we pay attention?
Well, certainly history shows that when there is a calamity, it gets people's attention and action is easier to get support for, but we're hoping that won't be the case. And in fact, in the public awareness of climate issues is increasing all the time. Every time we have severe weather events, people get alarmed. And I think in due time, the political process will reflect those public views into the elected officials and the decision makers. So I'm hopeful.
Lisa, thank you for joining us today for our conversation on climate policy. I'm Ron B., and thank you for joining us for UCSD Conversations.
Next on Conversations, John Helly from the Supercomputer Center and his colleagues discuss their project to understand and address how global climate change will ultimately affect your supply of tap water.
Climate and water have a very intimate relationship, and it's an interesting one in a lot of different ways, but one of the most intriguing things about it is that water is the medium that climate is expressed in. It moves across the earth in different forms. It moves from solids to liquids to gases, and it's the medium of exchange for all the energy that is stored on the earth, at least at the surface of the earth and in the oceans, and that's driven primarily by solar radiation. And that energy is absorbed to a large degree by the water on the earth and moved around the earth by the rotation of the earth and by what we think of as weather patterns. And so broad-scale changes in climate that we think of, particularly in the case of climate warming, that affect the distribution of water, are really changes in the distribution of energy and the way the energy is stored and moved on the earth by water in its various forms. When we say liquid, we're talking both about fresh and salt water, so we're talking not only about the water in the oceans, which is of course salt, but also the water that's stored in glaciers that we have in our rivers and streams, and the bulk of our fresh water is stored in glaciers, and that's why issues having to do with the change in the distribution and condition of glaciers, both at the North and South Poles and in the mountains all over the earth, are of concern. So one of the most interesting things about this is that climate's everywhere. Everywhere on Earth there's climate. There's also weather, of course, but the weather is kind of a localized or a more localized expression of climate. Climate is a long-term pattern of energy distribution on the Earth, and the location and variation, spatial variation and temporal variation, we see in different parts of the Earth as localized weather. We have to talk about different scales of measurement when we talk about climate in order for it to make sense, because we go all the way from global scales, which is where climate modeling and climate scientists tend to think most completely about the problem. But then in order for it to have meaning for society and for people in general, it's important to make that transition of information down to the local decision-making processes, the political decisions, the social decisions that we need to make in order to ensure stability of our human population, our human societies, and our ability to continue to survive and thrive on the earth as an ecosystem with us embedded in it. So when we look at these different scales, water crosses different spatial scales, and we talk about global scales, regional scales, and local scales. And the global scales are, as you might imagine, the entire Earth's surface. And we talk about regional. Regional is a fuzzier kind of concept. Regional can mean things like the western continental United States, could mean the Western Hemisphere. So regional really is contextually dependent, but local scales tend to mean things on the order of city scales, the scales where political decisions are made, or you are working in a bay or an estuary in your neighborhood and you can see pollution that's having an impact there, or changes in the distribution of salt and fresh water that affect the life and your ability to enjoy that, or for the organisms that live there to thrive well or not. And the interesting thing about climate, water, and scale is that We go across all of these scales. We go from global to regional to local scales, and water is important on all of those different scales, but it's the things that we concern ourselves with at each scale varies, and that's something we want to pay attention to. Climate has the power to change where water comes from and where it goes. And that's really the theme that we're trying to address here. How does climate change drive the distribution of water in a way that affects human societies all the way from global to regional to local scales?
The global change problem, of course, is one that has come into sharper focus, and I would say, fortunately, that the state of California and the California legislature is starting to think about the prospects of what might happen to the California water system with the prospect of climate change, which is a very real prospect. Using present-day models, there's a pretty strong likelihood that we'll see increases in temperature of something like 2 to perhaps 4 degrees Celsius above today's levels. Now, an important aspect of California's water system is the natural storage that is afforded to us from the California snowpack. The snowpack acts as a natural reservoir. California's artificial reservoir system is only large enough to capture about a year's worth of flow. So the amount of storage that we get in the snowpack is a really critical aspect of our water plan. That is, the ability to count on a spring snowmelt that is occurring during, when you think about it, a pretty manageable part of the year. In other words, it's happening after the real active winter storms have occurred, so that that water can be essentially managed without worrying about flood protection in the California reservoir system. The reservoirs we have are not only water storage vehicles, but they're shields for floods, and consequently, during the wintertime, we have to allow for a safety measure in those systems, so we can't catch all the water. But once the spring is upon us and the winter storm track has receded to the north, then we can let those levels creep up, so we can catch that water with more confidence that we're not going to have a safety issue. The problem with global change is that, first of all, we're not going to have as much snow, and secondly, the snow that we get will likely melt faster. So that using a fairly state-of-the-art model and I would say a conservative estimate of temperature change for the state, that is only about 2 degrees Celsius, our guess is that we're going to lose about half of the present day of snow accumulation in the combined Sierra drainages by the end of the present century, that is by about 2090 or so. So this is going to be an aspect of climate change that, assuming these models are fairly on the mark, we're going to have to contend with, and it's going to be a big challenge for California water, because we're going to have a lot of water coming off earlier than what we have today. And in fact, with the reservoir system that we have, it's pretty clear that we don't have enough storage capacity to hold it all. So we're going to have to adopt some new strategies.
At the Hydrologic Research Center, in collaboration with the Georgia Water Resources Institute, we developed a software package to assist reservoir managers in their job. And this is a software system that we call INFORM, for Integrated Forecast and Reservoir Management. It has components to take climate forecasts, downscale them down to the watershed sizes as appropriate, generate inflow forecasts for the reservoirs in a variety of forms, including their uncertainty. And lastly, take these forecasts and at a given risk level, generate trade-offs among the various uses of the reservoir water, such as hydroelectric power production, flood control, and downstream uses, domestic, agricultural, and others. Uncertainties are very important for INFORM. One of the objectives of the system is to try to characterize all the sources of uncertainty and incorporate these characterizations to the trade-off curves that the manager will see, so that the risk level that we provide is representative of these uncertainties. These uncertainties start from the uncertainties in the climate forecasts, which may be substantial for a given region on the globe, to the uncertainties of going from the large scale of the climate forecast to the small scale of the upstream catchment, to the uncertainties of the hydrologic models in terms of topographic, soil, land use, land cover data, to the uncertainty of the stream channels in terms of how exactly they convey water, how much sediment exists that constricts the conveyance, and other such issues. As part of this experimentation with INFORM, we also looked at the future. We looked at the next 30 years of climate as simulated with state-of-the-art climate models. And the results we found showed that under projected weather scenarios for California, the use of such integrated forecast management system, in fact, is much more beneficial than at the present conditions. The reason for that is that under weather conditions, even the large reservoirs such as Folsom will be very close to capacity. So it would matter much more to make judicious decisions to be able to manage essentially a relatively smaller volume that you have available for the reservoir. This is the wasteful spill of water downstream. 3 different scenarios of managing the reservoir are shown. The current practices, they don't use the forecast. The middle part is the integrated system that uses the forecasting management, the climate forecast and the hydrology forecast. And the last one is the system in a case where the manager is clairvoyant, knows precisely what's going to happen. And it's the ideal. I mean, you can never know that. And so we simply put it there to say that with present-day technology and models, we're approaching that.
We know that there are challenges to both policy and technology. The technology challenges because we're trying to come up with new ways of measuring and analyzing these systems and new ways of using computer and information technologies to address them. There are also challenges from environmental policy because without environmental information, the policy making is basically guesswork and very subjective. And technology, on the other hand, without a particular application, is pretty much an academic exercise. So we have an opportunity with water to make a transition across the policies and technology areas in a way that satisfies not only scientific curiosity purposes, but can very much enhance the ability of our society to address these challenges by better information, more timely information, and improve our ability to coexist with the natural systems that we live in. We have data, we combine with models, and the challenge is to construct those models in such a way that that data can be accurately reflected and reflect the natural processes that we're trying to model. We can then drive the models with observed weather, for example, precipitation and wind, and other factors that are present and important in the natural system, and take those results and present them as maps or present them visually in other forms and compare these with observations. And it's the process of doing predictions and comparison with observations that helps us understand what's going on. And once we have confidence in the modeling capabilities, then we want to use these in a predictive mode to make forecasts that would help us make decisions, intelligent decisions about how we should behave as a society to change our infrastructure, because if we do this, it will cause that result. Or if we do something different, we will have perhaps a more beneficial result. So the challenge and the excitement from a computer science point of view is to take the technologies, the big computers that we have, the large numbers of processors, and the ability to take large quantities of data, integrate them in a systematic way, and then present them in a useful visual presentation. That's one of the exciting things about using computers in this kind of a setting.
Next on Conversations, Detlef Stammer and Larry Smarr discuss the creation of a new computing center to better understand how the ocean and atmosphere will react to climate change.
Ocean observation is second nature to scientists at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. To monitor the state of the ocean, they dive the deep, navigate the surface, release weather balloons, install floating sensors, and download data streaming in from satellites circling the globe. But to make sense of it all and improve climate prediction, they also have to run simulations of ocean and atmospheric conditions over time. And to do that, they need raw computing power, lots of it.
Ocean and climate research becomes increasingly intensive computationally.
Detlef Stammer is a researcher at Scripps, responsible for computer modeling of activity in the world's oceans. And because he simulates ocean activity over decades, his models require many times more computing than required to show current conditions alone.
Just to give you a few numbers, the ocean state estimation, the data simulation, costs about 100 times as much as a normal modeling simulation does itself. And we used to be completely limited in terms of compute power, and not just for ocean modeling, but also for climate prediction. And one of the arguments why, for instance, the US falls or did fall behind, or for instance, Europe, really depend fundamentally on the fact that we did not have the right compute power.
Stammer is the director of COMPASS, the Center for Observations, Modeling, and Prediction at Scripps. It's a concerted and interdisciplinary effort in data analysis, numerical modeling, and data assimilation for ocean research. And with a growing demand to crunch numbers for ocean and atmospheric modeling, COMPASS began running into computational gridlock. So, with funding from the Office of Naval Research and the National Science Foundation, Stammer began building up his research group's computing capability. He also turned to the recently created California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology, CalIT Squared as it's known, a joint venture of UC San Diego and UC Irvine, brought with it links to its industrial partner, IBM. The result, 2 IBM PC clusters with a combined peak supercomputer-style performance of 500 billion calculations per second. Each 128-node cluster has 256 central processing units, CPUs, more than half of them donated by IBM through CalIT Squared. Larry Smarr, a professor of computer science and engineering at UCSD's Jacobs School of Engineering, is CalIT Squared's director.
It was very important that we were able to work with Detlef Stammer to build from just 16 processors up to over 500 in something like 9 months. The federal agencies helped, but the CalIT Squared industrial partnerships with IBM were the thing that really let us get the scale of machine we needed.
Having actually dedicated compute power means that we have all the power at hand, that we can do stuff, experiments, studies we had never been able to do before. And now having also the expertise at one place and the compute power creates a unique opportunity for all involved.
Dedicated in late 2001, the PC clusters are now up and running. The initial effort is focused not just on the ocean, but on the atmosphere as well. It takes a lot more computing power to look at coupled ocean atmospheric models than it does at ocean models alone, and combining the two is critical.
We know the El Nino is triggered by something out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and all of a sudden it makes differences on the storms hitting our coast here in California.
In El Nino's case, ocean temperatures affect climate, but the reverse also happens. Take the smog and aerosol problem over India and China. The pollution and haze is spreading through the Pacific with serious consequences for ocean temperatures worldwide.
Just to give you a number, about 30% less solar radiation is getting into the Indian Ocean right now. It has a seasonal cycle, but that has a significant impact on the heat content of the Indian Ocean, and we started to actually study that over a longer period, like 50 years. The next question is, how does the atmosphere respond to that changed ocean heat content, the flow field in the atmosphere will change, the monsoon system will change. We need to study that. We ultimately need to study that in a coupled system.
Without using a supercomputer, it took Stammer 3 years to complete this model for the impact of Central Asian pollution on global ocean temperatures. With his new PC clusters, he could do the same job in just 2 months. While much of the work looks at large-scale models, COMPAS will also use its computing power to scale down from the global level to regional climate models, not least for California. It's a major reason why Cal IT Squared got involved in the project.
In a way, California is the tail of the dog. The dog is the Pacific Ocean. If the dog moves a little bit, the tail moves a lot. And so for the future of California, the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we have to know in great detail how the ocean is going to be changing. That means we have to have the most powerful supercomputers available to model the ocean, compare it with measurements today so that we're sure we get the model right, and then let it go forward into the future.
If you look on the weather maps, you will realize that most of the weather or the currents come actually in from the west. So you cannot study California climate or changes just in isolation. You really need to actually have the large-scale flow field in the atmosphere and the ocean involved in that.
The new computing capability will allow COMPAS to step up its coastal California modeling, as well as simulate climate impacts such as drought and fire. And snowpack and watershed models will be crucial to predicting the state's future water supplies.
We're facing change to the water cycle because of global warming, because of growth of cities. And so we've got to scientifically understand every aspect of the water system. That means computing, it means data, it means putting new generations of sensors out into our streams, our snowpack, offshore, so that we have up-to-date data on all aspects of the water system. That's the only way we're going to be able to manage this for the future.
COMPAS is in a unique position to develop its ocean simulations because of its ability to factor in data from ongoing observation of the ocean by other Scripps research teams. Example, the Argo program, which is deploying 3,000 free-drifting floats around the globe. They measure the temperature and salinity of the upper 2,000 meters of the ocean, data transmitted to satellites and available within hours to COMPAS to plug into its models and simulations.
And that's actually what we do already on the clusters in a larger sense, that we use the ocean observations, bring them together with the ocean models, use atmospheric data to estimate a precise state of the ocean over the last 10 years. Our goal is 50 years.
It's the tying together of all these different scientists, all these different data sources into sort of a big brain, basically, that can integrate that data and help us understand where the climate is going.
And finally on Conversations, Mark Thiemens and Kimberly Prather unveil a new device which instantly analyzes atmospheric chemistry.
Mark, thank you for being here today. You're about to begin a major research effort here at UCSD to study the impacts of atmospheric aerosols on San Diego and the rest of the state, and the rest of the nation, in fact. Before we get into that, what exactly are atmospheric aerosols and why should we care about them?
Well, Kim, pleasure to be here first of all. Aerosols, quite simply, are particles in the atmosphere. They're small and respirable particles, which makes it one of the interesting aspects of why we care about them. There's a number of things that are really important with regard to aerosols. Number one, they serve as what are called cloud condensation nuclei. They can form clouds, which in turn will affect the climate by way of changing the water vapor content. They can also be dark or they can be light, so they can either scatter or absorb visible light and change the heat content of the atmosphere. So those on both a regional and hemispheric scale can change the climate of an area. Second part that gets to be more at home is that there are particles that can cause cardiovascular disease. The latest California report card for the health of the state show that 8,800 people per year can die in just the South Coast basin, and a large number of people in the San Diego region, for example, can be affected by cardiovascular disease such as bronchitis and whatnot, especially in elderly people and children. So in terms of health, there's a lot of very important issues as concerns people in hospitalization. A recent study in Science showed that there's a large number of lost days per year in the workforce by people that have breathing difficulties or decreased mobility. So simply put, people stay home instead of going to work. And so the cost of the economic sector can be significant in a given region, millions of hours of lost days per year just because of inhalation of particles. Then there's the effects that show up in the biodiversity, meaning the plant life in an area. Deposition of things like nitrate and sulfate aerosols can change the biodiversity. So plants that otherwise are local can be moved out of a region, and secondary alien plants can come in. Well, the plants that move out take with them the whole ecosystem that's associated with it, and so what you change is the entire biology of that system that's associated with those plants because of the change in the chemistry of the soil that's been brought in. The final part that shows up in an area like California at large is in terms of the coastal region. All of these things that are deposited eventually end up in the oceans and coastal regions, and that changes things and results in things like red tides, fish kills, loss of mammals, and life in general in terms of the biosystem in the coast. So all of these things are tied up with these particles that come in. Where they come from, what are they, how do they affect the climate, how do they affect the system, are all the sort of questions that we're interested in. As part of doing those sorts of things, we've recently, for example, hired a new person who has come to us from the University of California at Riverside, Professor Prather, who studies the composition and distribution of these single particle at a time, which is going to be parts of the equation that we're going to need to answer these sorts of questions in the future.
Kim, thank you for joining us today and for showing us your instrument. Now, your instrument measures individual particles from aerosols, and it does it in real time. What's important about that?
One of the most important things about particles is that they will have distinct signatures, distinct chemical signatures, depending on where they came from, the source that produced the particles. Traditional techniques sample a collection of particles for many hours on a piece of filter paper and then go and try to infer where these particles came from. What ends up happening is you scramble all the chemical signatures together and you really can't determine the original source of the particles. If you can look at each individual particle, they'll have a very distinct signature depending on where they came from. Dust will look like one thing, pollen will look like another thing, a particle from a diesel truck will look like one thing, and a car will look like a different thing. And so we can start to narrow down the sources of the particles of health concerns is a big issue. And we do this in real time because we're trying to understand how the chemistry of the atmosphere is changing and how different sources are contributing at different times to the particles in the air. So doing both of those is really this is the first instrument that has allowed you to look at both the size and composition of individual particles and do it in real time.
Now, is it possible to correlate some of the data that you receive in the real-time sense from your instrument with things like hospital visits, hospital admissions when people get sick?
Yes, that's one of the key things about the real-time data. Normally, in order to analyze particles, you collect for long periods of time, maybe 12 hours, in order to get enough material. If there's like a 1-hour period where there's a number of people who go to the hospital for respiratory problems, there's really no way to figure out which particles during which time period caused those problems. If we're looking at particles in real time with 10-minute resolution, we can basically say if there's a particular time, say 1 to 1:30 in the afternoon, where there's a spike, 1,000 people around the area go to the hospital, we can tell you exactly what the particles were during those times and hopefully be able to link it back to the source of the particles that created the problem.
Now, the instrument you've developed is sitting right here, and maybe you could explain how it actually does all these measurements as the particle enters the instrument. Where does the particle enter the instrument, and how does it go through its various detection processes?
Okay, well basically the particles are just, in this room there's millions and millions of particles that you just can't see because they're too small. The system is under vacuum, so where they enter is right here. You just can pop this cap off and the particles are pulled continuously into the instrument. They go through a region here where basically the particles are entrained in a gas, and they're going down, and they pass through 2 skimmers, which basically serve to collimate or narrow the particle stream. So you get a nice tight beam going through. The first thing they encounter is actually a laser on the other side that looks like this. And they encounter the laser beam. They scatter light. That's how we detect each particle. Then they go a little bit further and they encounter this laser actually, so they're oriented like this. So there's one in the back that you can't see. They encounter a second laser a set distance apart. They scatter the light from that laser. And so now we've measured the time it's taken the particle to go between those two laser beams. That is ultimately what we can correlate with particle size. When they enter the system, they pick up different velocities depending on their size. And so smaller particles move faster, bigger particles move slower. And so since we measure the time between there and there, we can figure out their size, which is super important for being able to figure out where they're going to go in our bodies from a health effects perspective. The tinier they are, tiny ones have been shown to be able to go all the way down into your bloodstream and be transported to your heart. So, it's really important to understand the size. The other thing you can do is, since you know how long it took to get between point A and point B, you can determine when it's going to get, that particle is going to get to the center of the region where we do the chemical analysis. This is a pulse laser, so you can fire it just at the right time to intersect that particle. You desorb and ionize the chemical species from that particle, and you analyze it with this big, long, rectangular tube is where you get the chemical information. And so you just continuously do that for millions and millions of particles, and you can monitor changes in the atmosphere as they occur.
How have you used this instrument before? I understand that there was a large climate study, Indox, in which you used this instrument.
The purpose of that study, as well as other sort of international studies we've done, is to understand differences in the particles in different regions of the world. And specifically tie the different particle compositions in with how you affect climate. And one of the issues is that we understand a lot about greenhouse gases and climate change, but the missing link is we don't understand how the chemistry of the aerosols is affecting climate change. As it turns out, particles actually are offsetting the warming that's occurring due to gases. And so what we're trying to do is figure out which particle composition or which particles are playing a role in affecting climate change, and how particle composition, how much the different particle compositions have an effect on the overall climate change. In Southern California, most of our work has been done in Riverside and in that area, the LA basin, where we've been trying to take this new technique and look at particles from different sources. We have very high particle pollution problems in California, and one of the key things is trying to figure out where those particles are coming from. And so we've been basically using the instrument to try and discriminate between sources of particles in those regions. We've done a lot in that area. We're just starting to do work in San Diego now that we just moved here. And so one issue is transport up from Tijuana. From Mexico, there's a lot of transport that comes up. There's transport that comes all the way over from Asia and in India. So that ties in with our international studies really well. So now our next step here is to try and understand the types of particles that are here and the possible health effects that might be associated with those, as well as the regional effects. These particles have an effect on global climate and meteorological patterns locally, and so we want to try and understand the particles that are in our atmosphere here.
You mentioned that San Diego is a unique environment or a unique coastal community because of the fact that we have a westerly flow in the atmosphere, and some of these particles are coming from far away. Where are they coming from, and how do you know that they're coming from these other places?
Our biggest piece of evidence is from satellite images. We can look at satellite images of long-range transport. We can see some of the best evidence has been these huge dust storms that originate in areas of Asia and India. It takes about 4 days for them to get here, but you can look from the satellite images and clearly see plumes coming all the way over to the West Coast. The unique thing about being here is we get to detect, basically it's high transport, and so they have to drop back down to be detected. But we're one of the first, we're the first region where you can detect it, and we can actually, definitely measure the particles as they come in from the different regions. Here in San Diego, the areas that we're most concerned about, as I mentioned, are Asia and India. And those regions have completely different particles than here. They're going to have a completely different climate influence. They're going to have very different effect on our, meteorology in the area when they do come over. And so, sort of understanding the particles from long-range transport, that's an area that is just starting to be tapped into now. How many there are and what's their relative proportions relative to other particles that are just produced locally.
How many instruments do you have running right now that are measuring some of these particulates in San Diego County? And what's your plan are you planning on locating a lot of them throughout Southern California or California in general?
Yeah, I mean, right now we have 3 transportable versions of like the version you see here. We have a lab-based instrument as well. And they're completely transportable, so we can move them wherever we want. And so far what we've done is just gone to regions and sit there for a couple of weeks and, you know, sort of figure out particles in that region. Problem with that is you don't always know whether that time period is representative of longer, you know, if that's really a snapshot of that, a good snapshot or a representative snapshot of that area. And so what we'd like to start doing, which we haven't done, is to be able to do longer term studies where we can set these instruments up, ideally up along the West Coast, and be able to monitor continuously, be able to get the data so you could go to your computer and at any given time see what's in the air right now. There's really there's no other way to do that, to see what the particles are. Typically, you have to wait months to get back the chemical information on what was in the air today. With these instruments, we hope to be able to do the trick is going to be the data processing, to be able to get this up on a website so anybody can go to any of these different sites and look at the composition of the particles in real time.
This issue of aerosols, what they are and what they influence, is fairly pervasive. It extends all the way from the climate of the planet to the local meteorology, the radiation coming into the earth, health and biology of a given region. So it's already a fairly broad interdisciplinary project. The University of California at San Diego is a special place. Roger Revelle, some 50 years ago, when he started putting together the university, decided that one of the things that was going to make us different from every place else, that we were going to be boundaryless in terms of our discipline. And so from the very beginning, the university was put together so that we would be able to work across these different boundaries. And one of the initial focuses, in fact, was on the environment. Roger Revelle, in fact, was one of the people who was the first persons to talk about the greenhouse effect. Now we're some 50 years later and we're worried about an issue that is going to be affecting the sustainability of a region. So now we're trying to put together the people in all the leading aspects of the problem. That includes people like Kim Prather and people in the chemistry and biochemistry department looking at the composition of these aerosols. What are they? What are their distributions? What are their properties? How does that feed into the people such as the Scripps Institution of Oceanography studying the climate aspects like Ramanathan? And the long-range transport, where are they coming from? How far are they going to go and how are they going to be distributed? Then we're going to look at the aspect of how will they couple into the biological diversity of the area? How do they influence an area like San Diego, which is already an affected area? We have a very fragile ecosystem here that's very rich, but it's very sensitive. We're in a water-starved region and it's already on the borderline of its sustainability. So how is that going to be affected? So the biology is obviously of interest. We're in an area that's an agricultural region. How is the agriculture and the economy going to be affected by these changes due to the distributions of the aerosols? And you can see how this starts to perpetrate throughout the whole system, leading to having to be able to make political decisions in terms of what are we going to do about this. And then there's the aspect of how does it actually affect us at the human level? How is cardiovascular disease affected? What's the toxicology? And if you look for any other given region in the entire planet, if you want to, that's coastal, susceptible to long-range transport, and sits on an international boundary, the University of California at San Diego is really the only place like that in the whole world. So anybody who wants to do a project like that and wants to meet those criteria has to face up to those issues, and we're the only place that can do it.